My name is Nancy Rosenblum. I'm a professor in the government department here, and welcome to Office and Responsibility, a symposium in honor of the career and contributions of Dennis Thompson. My co-organizer, Michael Rosen, and I are delighted to see you all here, friends and colleagues and others for whom Dennis's work has been an influence and a guide and a touchstone, and I'm sure for some of you a challenge. I want to thank the people who've made this symposium possible, beginning with the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics and Larry Lessig, its director, who was enthusiastic about this project from the start, who supported it intellectually, as you'll see, financially, and by allowing us to work with the superb Safra staff. And I'm grateful to Stephanie Dant and Francesca Holinko and Jennifer Campbell, who added organizing this conference to their already full schedule of business. They know how much work they did, and I hope they know how grateful we are for their high spirits and goodwill. The Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the Social Science Dean, Peter Marsden, also provided additional funding, as did the Government Department through our chair, Tim Colton. I want to acknowledge the participation of the Harvard Political Philosophy faculty. From the Government Department, from the Kennedy School of Government, and from the Philosophy Department, you'll notice that almost all of the panel chairs and discussants are us, Harvey Mansfield, Richard Tuck, Michael Sandel. You'll wonder why I'm reading my colleagues' names. It's good. Tim Scanlon, Jenny Mansbridge, Francis Kam, Eric Nelson, Eric Bierbaum, and Michael Frazier. You can imagine how unusual an event it must be to have brought us all here, not just clearing our calendars, but excitedly engaging intellectually together. When Michael Rosen and I first talked about the symposium last spring, we hoped that some of our colleagues would join us. And the fact that every one of them enthusiastically did is concrete testimony to Dennis's importance to us and our appreciation of him. So our thanks really in the end to Dennis for producing the work that we're honoring, for his generosity as a colleague and teacher, for his judgment, for his humor, which leavens the halls of Segis and which graced the hall of Grace University Hall and Mass Hall. The only difficulty Dennis presented to us is that his scholarship is so wide-ranging. We could have had a symposium on a host of themes in moral and political philosophy and in the history of political thought. Well, we settled on office and responsibility. We're fortunate to have a brilliant, really, roster of panelists to help us work our way through this puzzling and actually significant and always ripe subject, which Michael Rosen is going to introduce.
Thank you, Nancy, and may I only add one very significant name to those who deserve thanks, but the most central one. We should all thank Nancy herself, for who's done, as I know, far more than her share to make this occasion possible. The subject of our conference is political ethics, a field in which, as we all know, Dennis Thompson has played an indispensable role. Our title, Office and Responsibility, makes it indisputably clear, surely, how important the subject with which we'll be dealing is. And yet, to be frank, the identity of political ethics can, for me and I think perhaps for others as well, sometimes seem hard to grasp. On the one hand, democratic societies do things that, while legal, are, some people argue at least, open to ethical criticism. For instance, they adopt policies that disproportionately favor the interests of powerful groups, fail to play their part in international collaboration on matters of urgent interest, impose confiscatory fiscal regimes, or whatever. We all, I'm sure, have our own lists. Individuals will, of course, be involved in advocating and implementing such policies, but we can't surely evaluate their actions ethically except as part of a principled ethical account of the political system as a whole. On the other hand, political agents sometimes take actions that are illegal. In that case, by contrast, the ethical issues seem relatively clear. No one thinks it's permissible to employ a team of burglars to enter the headquarters of your political opponents. And the problem is how to design political institutions so that their necessarily powerful members can be held properly to account without undermining such people's necessary freedom of action. In short, or so the worry is, political ethics either expands until it comes to include all of the issues of justice and legitimacy that constitute political philosophy, or it shrinks to become a set of merely technical questions regarding institutional design. As so often in political theory, I think, a glance at history can be helpful in addressing this puzzlement. For certainly that was not always the case. Indeed, there was a time when political ethics was quite obviously at the center of political theory. I'm thinking of those works of advice to princes, exhorting rulers to be wise, just, and pious, the genre that Machiavelli both subverted and completed. Political ethics, then, seemed a natural and obvious starting point when the focus of politics was the action of a single agent, the ruler. But our societies are different. We live in polities in which individual politicians are accountable to the broad mass of citizens they represent. Does that mean that political ethics has disappeared? By no means. A moment's reflection on that phrase familiarly used to characterize the self-understanding of modern republics, a government of laws and not a government of men, makes this clear. For plainly, laws don't apply and enforce themselves as impersonal and automatic mechanisms, nor does applying law exhaust the domain of politics. And once we remind ourselves of this obvious fact, we realize why the questions of political ethics remain indispensable. We need to bring agency back in. Still, there's no doubt that political ethics in the modern state has changed, even though some of the vocabulary, virtue and corruption, to take two obvious examples, remain with us from an earlier age. We may now need to distinguish, for example, between institutional and individual corruption and think about the relationship between the two. We need to think about what principles should guide agents engaged in collective deliberation to form ethically defensible, publicly justifiable decisions. We need to develop an ethical framework to constrain participants in public life in the absence of the norms that were once derived, or at least claimed to be derived, from a monistic framework of religious belief. And we need to consider the enormous complications that arise for the responsibility of individuals when agents act collectively. These are, I'm sure you'll agree, momentous questions. They're some of the questions that, with the help of our extraordinary group of speakers and panelists, including, of course, most notably Dennis himself, we'll be addressing over the next 2 days. I can only say that we, the organizers, are as eager as you are to hear their ideas, and so it's my pleasure now to hand you over to Michael Sandel, Anne and Robert Bass, Professor of Government at Harvard University, who will chair the first panel.
Well, it's a great privilege to chair this, the first of these panels on Dennis's work and to pay tribute to him. And I want to take just small advantage of chairing this session to just say one word or two about Dennis. Dennis is known, and we will be discussing across this day and a half, for accounts of ethics, compromise, deliberation, and corruption. But I first encountered Dennis, before I actually met him, when I was sitting in the library as a graduate student, the Balliol College Library, and I took off the shelf a book called The Democratic Citizen, Social Science and Democratic Theory in the 20th Century. And I read it there, and I was struck to learn that actually Dennis had done a good part of the early writing of that, the development of his thoughts, when he was there. And it talked about, in a way, it was a book about compromise, though compromise has only figured in more recent titles of Dennis's book. He's told us how we can find our way to reasoned compromise in public life on even the most fraught issues: abortion, same-sex marriage, maybe even campaign finance reform. But in this early book, what some of you will remember is that he addressed the prospect of compromise on an issue even more fraught than those, and that is a compromise or a coming to terms between political scientists on the one hand and political theorists on the other. And in a way, the panel we have today is testimony to Dennis's success at promoting a spirit of compromise, not only in public deliberation generally, but also in the academy and among political scientists and political theorists. His focus on democratic theory has shown that we have maybe something to say to one another, the occupants of these, as he called them then, rival camps, and he has embodied and demonstrated that possibility. To begin our panel, so I want to say, but on many levels, how many contributions Dennis has made to ethics, to the army of ethically informed professionals he's trained, to the army of teachers of ethics that he has sent out across the academy in this country and around the world. And we all here really are the beneficiaries of those many contributions. So our speaker at this first session is Larry Lessig. And Larry, I think, would probably share the sentiment expressed by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson succeeded Benjamin Franklin as U.S. ambassador to Paris, and he was once introduced, Jefferson was, as Benjamin Franklin's replacement. And Jefferson said, no, Mr. Franklin is irreplaceable. I would describe myself as his successor. Larry is a stellar figure in law, and Harvard was fortunate enough to be able to tempt him to come to take up the leadership of the Safra Center when Dennis stepped down. And so what could be more fitting than to have him launch us on this symposium in honor of Dennis's work and career on institutional corruptions. Larry Lessig.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Nancy. It's indeed an incredible honor to have the chance to launch this conference in honor of a man who actually had much more important role in the trajectory of my life than I think any other scholar. Early in my career, I came to Harvard as a fellow at what was then the program in Ethics in the Professions. And Dennis took me to lunch, and he introduced me to the intellectually interesting conundrum of intellectual property. A question which I had thought about a little bit in the context of the law of cyberspace, but hadn't recognized that a political philosopher might find it interesting. And when I realized a political philosopher might find it interesting, it began to be interesting to me as well. And that launched me on what was 10 years of my life of work, trying to work through sensible intellectual property policies. And at the end of that 10 years, I was convinced it was hopeless. There was no chance that we could convince a political system of sensible thought. And that led me back to Dennis's framework, because I recognized the reason for this was grounded primarily in an institution of government which had lost its way, which was, in the sense Dennis would describe, institutionally corrupt. And so that brought me back here to be Dennis's successor, to continue a work in this field, and to see whether there was hope in this project to bring back something hopeful for this democracy. So I want to begin by focusing on one of the fields which Dennis's work helped us understand, the field of corruption. Dennis, of course, has worked on this forever. I've worked on this field for a relatively short period of time, but I'm encouraged that in a poll that Gallup conducted in July, the number 2 most important issue that Americans identified for the next president of the United States to address was corruption in government. I'll then note, of course, that the one issue on the top 10 list that neither campaign even mentions on its website is corruption. But that notwithstanding, I think this is because we have come to a place that makes Americans very anxious about the very institution of this government. But in the context of this anxiety, we as an intellectual enterprise face another kind of problem. And that is that the conception of corruption that animates most as they think about the problem is a conception suggested by figures like this, Randy Duke Cunningham, William Jefferson, figures who have taught us the meaning of quid pro quo corruption. Illegal activity, a simple conception of evil that is clear within our legal tradition and inspires a kind of attitude of self-righteousness and certainty, which allows people like Laura Undercuffler to write sentences like this. Corruption is a status. A person, when corrupt, has changed. Evil has captured her being, her essence, her soul. It is a searing indictment, somehow not only of A's act, but of A's character. It is a statement not only of what A has done, but of what A has become. I actually think, as predicated of the United States Congress, it's a little bit unfair to use this gender-appropriate pronoun here. There's actually only one female congressperson in the history of the United States Congress who has ever been convicted of any criminal act related to corruption. So let's talk about the evil men who have been led in this particular way to be something different, to become something different. The question corruption asks is, what have they become? Now, but what's striking about this conception of corruption is that it's very different from the conception that animated the framers of our Constitution. As Leslie Hill describes when talking about Adam Smith's conception of corruption, she says, until the end of the 18th century, corruption had a much broader meaning than it does today. It referred less to the actions of individuals than to the general moral health of the body politic. Corruption was not so much an individualized breach of duties as a condition that spread contagiously and diffusely throughout the polity, affecting leaders and citizens alike. So when we speak of what A has become and mean by that an individual, the framers of our tradition would also perhaps have thought about what an institution had become, and indeed more broadly what a society had become, because of influences that drove it away from what it ought to become. Now, at this stage, this issue, I think, has become critically important because, paradoxically, this institution, on this issue at least, is stuck in the 21st century. Oddly, because this institution, constituted the way it is, seems obsessed with the 18th and 17th century in most of its conceptions of how our Constitution should be read. But on this issue, it's as if we only have the 21st and 20th century conception of corruption. And in this case, Citizens United versus the FEC, when the Supreme Court upheld unlimited independent expenditures by corporations and reaffirmed the idea of unlimited independent expenditures by individuals, we were instructed by the court that Buckley, that original case, identified a sufficiently important governmental interest in preventing corruption or the appearance of corruption. That interest was limited to quid pro quo corruption. So, independent expenditures on that conception of corruption is not corruption because corruption is quid pro quo, and by definition, independent means there could have been no quid pro quo. And so we have a limited conception which guides and authorizes Congress to address this a fundamental flaw within our government. And so the challenge for practical political philosophy, the challenge is to find a way to move beyond the individual conception of corruption to an institutional sense of corruption that might inform political theory as well as legal theory in its understanding of the appropriate power of Congress to address what has become a fundamental flaw in our government. Now, of course, that's the challenge of Thompson's work for a long period of time. His book, Ethics in Congress of 1995, frames this conception of the move from individual to institutional corruption. His writing has continued to articulate this sense of the broader conception or a different conception of institutional corruption, a conception which is at the core, I think, perfectly clear. But the question I want to address today is whether there's a way to make it more usable in the context of a legal debate about the appropriate scope of congressional authority, or at least for me, more usable as a legal philosopher, as a legal academic, this conception of corruption as institutional corruption. The challenge is, can we make it easily predicate of this institution? Okay, so here's an argument to get us to that place. I first want to set this in the context of what Dennis has given us. Dennis, of course, in his framing of this conception of corruption, begins with the ordinary sense of individual corruption, as he defines it. Individual corruption is personal gain or benefit. In the context of a public official, it would be gifts, foreign trips, sexual favors, and employment for the official's family beyond what's specified or appropriate for that official. So personal gain or benefit by a public official in exchange for promoting private interests. And in this conception, it embraces directly the sense of quid pro quo corruption, because what's necessary to establish this conception of corruption is a showing of a certain idea, a certain relationship between what was intended and what was done. The mens rea here, that I intended to exchange one for the other, defines the essence of what we think of as individual corruption. And so by contrast with this sense of personal individual corruption, Dennis introduced the idea of institutional corruption. Political gain or benefit, where political gains would be goods usable primarily in the political process, so political support, fundraising in the context of a campaign. Political gain or benefit by a public official under conditions that in general tend to promote private interests. And it is these tendencies of a practice that define what might be described as this conception of institutional corruption. So putting these two against each other, the distinction between the two definitions is one is talking about personal gain and the other political gain, and one is talking about the mens rea of in exchange for promoting, while the other is talking about general conditions that might lead to the kind of corrupting effect that we're describing. So let's take a very simple example. Imagine a campaign contribution given to a congressperson while that congressperson is doing a favor for the contributor. Is that institutional corruption? So it is clearly a political gain. That's what the contribution is. And the question is it under conditions that in general tend to promote these private interests? And here the conditions are while doing a favor for this particular contributor. And the surprising answer that Dennis offers to that relatively straightforward hypothetical is it may or may not be an instance of institutional corruption. And what that points to is the need to fill in the sense of what this influence might be deviating from, what it might be, in effect, corrupting. So as he describes, it is not corrupt if the practice it promotes, or at least does not damage political competition, citizen representation, or other core processes. And by contrast, it is corrupt if it is a type that tends to undermine such processes and thereby frustrate the primary purpose of the institution. So to fill in such processes. So if it's to undermine political competition, citizen representation, or other core processes. And that then invites us to fill out what are the substantive values that we think the process should be advancing, such that we have a baseline against which to measure the corruption these practices might be encouraging. So as he simplifies or draws together a large body of his work, he describes these as principles of legislative ethics. And these principles include independence, deciding cases on the merits, fairness, playing by the rules, and accountability, sustaining public confidence. So if we go back to our example of campaign contributions while doing a favor for the contributor, if there is a place it's most likely to trigger the analysis to say that there's an instance here of institutional corruption, it's likely in the context of independence, because our suspicion here is, in a case like this, these trades are trades that deviate from deciding the issue on the merits. And so therefore it's this argument that would have to be advanced in order to sustain the claim that the practice identified is indeed institutionally corrupt. But I want to take that simple example and think about it a little bit more generally. And I'm going to give you two hypotheticals that I want you to hold in your head as you think about which is and which isn't institutional corruption. So one hypothetical, let's call it hypothetical A, it says, imagine a large union with a very large membership and a very specific set of issues that it cares about. Imagine further that the union regularly and reliably turns out its membership to vote for candidates who achieve at least 90% rating on the union's scorecard. Imagine finally a politician who votes in a way to assure that she receives 90% or more on the union's scorecard. So that's hypothetical 1, A. Here's hypothetical B. Imagine a large association of businesses representing a very large pool of wealth and a very specific set of issues that it cares about. Imagine further that the association regularly and reliably directs a large amount of campaign funding to candidates who achieve at least a 90% rating on the association's scorecard. And imagine finally a politician who votes in a way to assure that she receives 90% or more on the association's scorecard. Okay, so when we think about these two hypotheticals, and ask the question, where is the institutional corruption? Is there institutional corruption in both of these cases? In neither of these cases? In one case or the other? And more precisely for the legal question, what must we know? Not so much as a political philosopher who can afford, who can engage this question in a way that doesn't necessarily rely upon convincing people, by definition, less intelligent than she, but as a lawyer, which includes, by necessity, convincing people, well, less intelligent than the political philosopher. So what are the elements of the proof necessary to persuade the lawyer, or let's think in particular about lawyers who produce documents like this? So to answer that question, I want to introduce you to a place called Lesterland. It wasn't revealed to you in the introduction by Michael because he's kind in this way, but my first name is actually Lester. It's a secret, so don't tell anybody that. But as a Lester, I'm allowed to make fun of Lesters, so that's what I want to do here. I want to make fun of Lesters in the context of describing Lesterland. So Lesterland looks a lot like the United States. Like the United States, it has about 311 million citizens. Of that 311 million, 144,000 are named Lester. We know this about the United States too, because that's what the internet tells us, and it must be true. So therefore, 144,000 are named Lester, which means about 0.05% of Lesterland is named Lester. Now, Lesters in Lesterland have a very interesting power. Lesterland has two elections, a general election and a Lester election. In the Lester election, only Lesters get to vote. In the general election, all citizens over the 18, and in some states, if you have an ID, get to vote. Okay, but here's the catch. To run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the Lester election. You don't necessarily have to win, you just must do extremely well. So that's the picture of the democracy in Lesterland. What can we say about Lesterland? Well, I think number one, we can say with the Supreme Court in Citizens United that the people in Lesterland have the ultimate influence over the elected officials. Because, of course, there's a general election. Everyone gets to vote in the general election, but only after the Lesters have had their way with the candidates who wish to win in the general election. Number two, we can say, obviously, maybe, this dependence upon the Lesters will produce a subtle and understated and camouflaged bending to keep the Lesters happy. And number three, we can say that reform that angers these Leicesters is, we could say, unlikely. Okay, so that's Leicesterland. I want you to recognize three things about Leicesterland. Number one, the United States is Leicesterland. The United States also looks like this. The United States also has two elections. One election is called the general election. The second election is called the money election. In the general election, all citizens over 18, and in some states, if you have an ID, get to vote. In the money election, the funders of political campaigns get to vote. And once again, the trick is to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the money election. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. And the key for this analogy to work is to recognize there are just as few relevant funders in the United States as there are Leicesters in Leicesterland. Now you say, really? 0.05%? Could that possibly be true? Well, here's some numbers. 2010, 0.26%. I know you're skeptical. He's a lawyer. Does he really know how to do percentages? But I really mean 0.25% of America contributed $200 or more in a congressional election. 0.05% gave the maximum amount to any congressional candidate. 0.01%, the 1% of the 1%, gave $10,000 or more in the election cycle. And in this presidential cycle, the latest statistics say that 0.000015%, for those of you doing the numbers, that's 47 Americans, have given 42% of the super PAC money that has been spent in the presidential election cycle to date. So I look at this range of numbers and I invoke my status as a lawyer to say this is a pretty good average in this range of numbers. It's a good average to say that the funders in our system are our Leicesters in this Leicesterland. Now, like we could say about Leicesterland, we could say about the United States. Number one, the Supreme Court was right in Citizens United. The people have the ultimate influence over elected officials, but only after the money election has had its effect on those who wish to win. And number two, obviously, this dependence upon the funders produces a subtle, understated, camouflaged bending to keep the funders happy. Estimates that have been done suggest that candidates for Congress and incumbents spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back to power. They develop in that process, as any of us would, a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their view in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, the Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. And that leads to point three. Reform in this country that angers the funders is, again, we might say, highly unlikely. So that's the first point I want to make. The United States is Leicesterland. Here's the number two. The United States is worse than Leicesterland. It's worse than Leicesterland. Because you can imagine in Leicesterland, if we Leicesters got this letter from the government that said, you have this enormous power. You have to pick the candidates who will run in the general election. We, because we're distributed throughout the society, we might begin to think, well, we've been chosen. Kind of aristocratic attitude would overcome us. We'd begin to think we should act and vote in the interest of the country as a whole. Why are we here except to do something like that? But in this Leicesterland, it's at least possible the Leicesters would act for the good of Leicesterland. But in our land, in this land, in USA land, the Leicesters act for the Leicesters. Because the shifting coalitions that constitute the 0.05% are shifting precisely in light of the issues that are on the horizons that will directly affect their own interest. If it's global warming, coal companies are among the Leicesters. If it's healthcare, insurance companies and doctors and pharmaceutical companies are among the Leicesters. This shifting coalition is not directed at the public interest, it's directed against the public interest, and in this sense we could say USA is worse than Leicesterland. But here's point three, most relevant to this conversation. Whatever we want to say about the tradition of Leicesterland, in our land, in our Leicesterland, in our USA land, this conflicting dependence this conflicting dependence is, I want to submit, corruption. It's not corruption in a brown paper bag sense of the word. It's not corruption in a Rob Blagojevich sense of the word. It's not quid pro quo corruption. I want to say it's corruption relative to the framers' baseline for this republic. So their baseline. Now, it's the weird thing about we lawyers that in thinking about our constitution, we spend a great deal of time and effort trying to understand how it was explained to us in a series of essays that have been collected under the doctrine of, under the title The Federalist Papers. Why? Because they're not, in a lot of ways, good, some of them at least, is obscure. This is kind of for us the brief, the successful brief that made the case to the American public about why the Constitution should be ratified. And in the Federalist Papers, at the core, there is a theory of our government in Federalist 10, which has played an important role in our understanding of our tradition. Indeed, as Larry Kramer described it in the Harvard Law Review, it's difficult to overstate the importance of this theory to today's understanding of the Constitution and American government. Now, at the core of this theory is an understanding of faction. And as Madison describes in Federalist 10, by faction I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. And to address this problem of factions, Madison maps out the two possible ways to do it, one by removing the causes, the other by controlling its effects. Very quickly, he eliminates the option of thinking about the causes and focuses on the effects. Now, to understand which effects will be controlled, he has to think about the difference between the two categories of faction. One category is the faction, a minority faction, a faction of less than a majority, which is solved, he said, by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. It, the minority faction, may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. So in this sense, the minority faction problem is there, but it's not terribly dangerous. And the majority faction, though, is the more problematic of the two. Majority faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice its ruling passion or interest, both the public good and the rights of other citizens, to secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and focus and the form of popular government, is then the great objectives to which our inquiries are directed. So this is the problem he wants to solve. And then with a little bit of hand-waving, he comes to the end of Federalist 10 and announces he basically has found the solution to this problem of majority faction. And it turns out that the vices of a large, extended republic are the virtues that guaranteed this republic will solve its problem of majority faction. Because we have lots of different interests spread across a large republic, they will never be able to gather together in sufficient force to overcome the will of the majority and therefore defeat the objectives of this Republican government. And that structure is the sort of structure which, for example, Justice Breyer in Clinton versus the United States describes as the genius of the framers' pragmatic vision. Here's the problem. This conception turned out to be totally wrong. Totally wrong. The faction, the majority faction, was not solved by his mechanism. It was solved by a Bill of Rights to the extent it's been solved. And the minority faction just has not been solved. The problem of minority faction is with us today and as strongly as it has ever been. So from this sense, we could say it's a bust. Maybe we'd give it an F if we gave Fs at the Harvard Law School. But what's puzzling is this idea that this Ur text, as the Harvard Law Review describes it, has at its core this fatal flaw. But as an participant in this tradition of American legal scholarship, I too believe this text has something to teach us, and I want to drive less at the mechanism Madison was describing and more at a principle which he said it was articulating, the Republican principle. Because, of course, the framers didn't give us a, quote, democracy, they gave us a republic. And by a republic, the Federalist tells us, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, Madison tells us in Federalist 52, they meant a democracy that would have a branch of government that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. Okay, so here's their model of government. We have the people, we have the government. I do my own slides. It's cool the way that bounces like that. You know, Madison didn't have keynote like this. Okay, people and the government that creates this exclusive dependency. And it's that exclusive dependency that would assure that the public good would be found, an exclusive dependency upon the people. The problem, of course, is that Congress has evolved a different dependence. No longer exclusively upon the people, if ever, it's now increasingly its dependence upon the funders as well. Now, this is a dependence too, but in light of the Republican principle, we should see it as contrary to the Republican principle because it's a different and conflicting dependence from a dependence upon the people alone, so long as the funders are not the people. Now, my claim is this is a corruption. I believe this corruption has an effect. I think its first effect is it leads Americans to believe. It's a separate question whether they're right. I believe they're right, but let's put that to the side. Americans believe money buys results in Congress. 75%, according to a poll that I conducted for the book I published last year, believe that. A little bit higher Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before Congress changed in 2010, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's something we all as Americans believe. Money buys results in Congress. Leading to point number 2, that belief erodes trust in the institution of Congress. ABC and the New York Times last year said that there was 9% confidence in the institution of Congress. 9%? Right? Keep that in some perspective. It's certainly the case at the time of the American Revolution. A higher percentage of Americans had confidence in the British Crown than who have confidence in our Congress today. Leading to point number 3, that erosion erodes participation in the process. Rock the Vote, which turned out the largest number of young voters in the history of voting in the United States in 2008, found in 2010 a significant number of their young voters were not going to show up. They asked them why. The number one reason, by far 2-to-1 over the second highest reason, was, quote, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. Vast majority who could have voted in 2010 did not vote, in part, at least, because of this belief. This is a corruption, and it has an effect, and that effect, in my view, should be enough to convince this institution, if it could be unstuck from the 21st century, to expand its conception of corruption. Corruption not limited to quid pro quo corruption alone. The court could say corruption is not limited, but might include what I would call here dependence corruption, and I would submit is a type of institutional corruption too. Okay, so where does it sit, this conception of corruption? Conception of dependence corruption relative to the conception of institutional corruption. Well, this conception of corruption, both individual and institutional, of course, is focused on corruption of an individual. So in the context of individual corruption, it's focused on individuals like that. In the context of institutional corruption, of course, Dennis's book was inspired by the activities of individuals like that, the Keating Five. Focused on individuals. And as I look back to those halcyon days of Keating Five corruption, I think, would that that were our problem today. Would that all we had to worry about was individual congresspeople or groups of congresspeople engaging in activities that would qualify as institutional corruption in the way Dennis has framed it. But what dependence corruption tries to say is that there's a corruption that predicates not of the activity of these individuals, but of the institution, by identifying the way a wrong dependence has been allowed to evolve. And so the question is, should we think of that as a kind of institutional corruption too? Should we think of it as fitting within the form of institutional corruption that Dennis describes? Well, it's consistent here with the idea focused on the way in which tendencies would tend to undermine the conception of the appropriate role of government. It's certainly consistent with the principle of legislative ethics, although independence here doesn't draw so directly upon this conception of deliberative democracy, but instead simply upon the conception of an improper dependency allowed to evolve inside the system and influence of this government. So, for example, think about the way that difference might inform the hypotheticals I began with. One hypothetical about a union having power to turn out votes, and the other hypothetical about businesses having power to produce a large contribution. Between these two, I think we should say whether or not institutional corruption would condemn one or the other or both or neither, it's at least easier to see the way in which dependence corruption condemns one but not the other. It condemns one, the giving of money, but not the production of votes by union members, because as a contingent description about the character of politics in America today, we can see the way in which our government has become dependent upon the one, and not in the general sense of our government dependent upon the other. And indeed, to the extent they've become or depend upon turning out votes was the dependency envisioned by a dependency upon the people alone, not the dependency of the funders, of the lesters, to make the voting process possible. Okay, that's the argument. Here's what I think I want to say this says. The aim of my project, building upon Dennis, is a usable standard, contingently usable standard. I'm not saying it's usable in every moment of our history, but its usability, I think, has got to be the key if we're going to take this conception and this rich body of work and direct it in a way that makes it plausible, possible for an institution which is blocking the opportunity of this democracy to save itself, to once again permit this democracy to save itself. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Larry, for getting us off to such a terrific start. I would like to call up now Jenny Mansbridge and Ken Shepsle. As you wish. Okay. And they will give some responses to Larry's paper, and then we're going to let Dennis have a word in, and then a general discussion. Jenny.
Okay, great. Hello. This paper is a fabulous paper. In it, Larry Lessig elegantly analyzes and expands on Dennis Thompson's concept of institutional corruption. It's a delight to read, and as you've just seen, it's a delight to see on the screen, full of playfulness and thought-provoking analogy and insight. Larry has adopted this important concept as the centerpiece of a 5-year research project to understand and help remedy the problem of institutional corruption. We have long needed a distinction, at least between legal and illegal corruption, but that distinction has foundered in the absence of incisive thought about what features would make legal corruption corruption. And in Dennis's path-breaking 1995 work, and in his continuing work, and in Larry's work, we now have a major contribution to that thought. Now, can you imagine yourself in the position I was reading this paper? It's a sort of a commentator's nightmare. You just say, oh, this is good, 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 this is really good, you know. And you think, gosh, you know, what am I going to do? Just get up there and say, well, this is great, and then you can sit down. Luckily, I found something that I thought was missing, so I will talk a little bit about the something that was missing. In his Boston Review article, which, and Larry, you may have changed the definition of institutional corruption from then, I'm not sure, but at any rate, at that point, Larry defined institutional corruption this way. Quotes, institutional corruption describes an influence, financial or otherwise, within an economy of influence that weakens the effectiveness of an institution, especially by weakening public trust in that institution. And he adds that he'll use the term an economy of influence rather than the simpler system of influence to emphasize the reciprocal character of such influence, often requiring little or no direct coordination. Now, for purposes of our discussion today, I'm going to leave out all the qualifying clauses, those qualifying clauses, which are important for other reasons, and go to the heart of the definition, which is that, quotes, institutional corruption describes an influence that weakens the effectiveness of an institution. Now note that effectiveness is a matter of outcomes, not procedures, and not principles. I think this is the wrong way to think about the problem. Dennis himself has always been careful to use the word process when talking of institutional corruption, as in each of the quotations that Larry provides from Dennis's recent paper in the book, in the article, sorry. I will go further and argue that when we think about institutional corruption, we should focus on the ways that an institution fails to live up to principles that are good in their own right, as well as fundamental to the purposes of the institution, and that thus help legitimate the institution. For example, in the institution we call democracy, the principle of an equally weighted vote is valuable in its own right, the way keeping a promise is valuable in its own right. The principle of equally weighted votes is not valuable because it leads people to trust government and therefore contributes to government effectiveness. Rather, it's valuable in itself, and because it's linked to the fundamental purposes of the institution, coming close to it in practice helps a democracy legitimate itself, and that legitimation can then lead to trust, which can then make the institution more effective. Let's go straight to Larry's primary example. Larry asks us to imagine a union with a very large membership that turns out its membership to vote, and a politician who votes in a way to assure that she receives 90% or more of on the union scorecard. And then he asks us to imagine an association of businesses representing a large pool of wealth, and a politician who votes in a way to assure that she receives 90% on the association scorecard. And he asks, what more must we know before we can say that one of these practices is or is not an instance of institutional corruption? I would say we needed to know nothing more. The union is not undermining the fundamental democratic principle of one person, one equally weighted vote. The business association is. That's the principle. One equally weighted vote, one person. It's as simple as that. Now, why do Dennis and Larry need to develop a far more complex theory when one commonly accepted principle, the principle of equal weight, can do the trick? A large part of the answer is it's not as simple as that. The unions not only have many members, they also have organization, and that allows them to gain greater influence through pickets and through door-to-door canvassing, while the business association surely should be allowed to use its money to influence the debate through ads and so forth. This is all true. Many here have tried to think through these problems in these terms, balancing value against value. But note that Larry's example, as worked here, rests solely on the union's capacity to turn out its membership to vote. So these issues are not implicated. Why then is the principle of equal weight not even mentioned in Larry's paper? Perhaps because the overall emphasis in this combined work of Larry and Dennis is on complex understandings of fairness and also Chuck Bites. And I think that emphasis on complex understanding of fairness is good, but it tends to obscure the underlying value of specific principles within the complexity. Perhaps also an emphasis on deliberation, which I also believe is good, may obscure the principles we need for the part of democracy that is about power. So now I'm going to proceed in 4 brief stages. First, I'll make a case for the sources and bona fides of the principle of equal weight. Then I'll indicate very briefly why Dennis, and more substantively Chuck Bites, and then Larry too, only perhaps implicitly, have rejected that principle. And then I'll try to show that although the principle of equal weight has problems, some analytic distinctions may save it. And the problems are in any case not so great as to lead us to reject that principle entirely. The principle of equal weight ought to play a significant role in any discussion of money in the institutional corruption of democracy. And then finally, I'll conclude using that example that principles in general should play a significant role in the definition of institutional corruption, not just effectiveness. So in my example of the principle of votes of equal weight, the principle derives, I believe, from two sources. The first is, in the words of an earlier age, we're all children of God. And as we put it today, and Dennis has done so elegantly in his works, we all deserve equal respect. An equally weighted vote reflects that respect. And the second source, however, is a bit less uplifting. It is simply default. Isaiah Berlin pointed out that in the very conception of a rule, equality is the default. In formal justice, all members of a category are to be treated equally unless reasons can be given for unequal treatment. So the principle of equal weight rests heavily on default. It's hard to give reasons why there should be votes of unequal weight, as well as on the larger, more inspiring reason of equal respect. Now, the general belief that votes and the principle that votes should be of equal weight is relatively new. It may not be much older than 1963, although the Supreme Court justices who used that principle in the reapportionment cases tried to locate the principle in the Constitution and in the discussion of the founders, that OR document that you heard about. The majority's argument in these reapportionment cases is a little strained because they tried to find a textual basis for the principle of a vote of equal weight in the words, "we the people," and in the general commands of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But the very tenuousness of the link to any actual wording in the Constitution demonstrates to me the degree to which the principle was by then generally accepted as a democratic fundamental. The court simply couldn't have gotten away with saying this principle was in the Constitution if the public hadn't already considered it the kind of thing that should be in the Constitution. So the reliance of the justices in the reapportionment cases on the principle of equal weight is my exhibit A, that this principle is widely believed to be fundamental to democracy. And exhibit B is you. When you feel outrage over the billionaires pouring their money into the campaigns this election year, aren't you feeling right now, at least in part, it's not fair for them to have so much influence? In a democracy, voters are supposed to be equal. You feel there's been a violation of the principle of equal weight. So if this is such an obvious principle that the justices on the Supreme Court, relying on the beliefs of the American public, and you yourselves fasten on it, why has it become invisible in the discussion of institutional corruption? Why wasn't it the obvious answer to Larry's question about why the miners differ from the business association? Why did we have to go through more or less the whole talk? Why couldn't we have just somebody in the audience shouted out, principle of equal weight? That's what distinguishes between the miners and the business associations. Now, I believe that Chuck Beitz and Dennis Thompson, Chuck Beitz, who's here, an old friend, and perhaps Dennis, and perhaps Larry too, have rejected that principle over quickly in favor of the broader and harder to wield principle that, to use Chuck's words, the terms of participation in democracy ought to be fair, in the sense that no citizen has a sufficient reason to refuse to accept them. The procedures of a democracy should treat citizens as equals or with equal respect. For example, Dennis's relatively recent book, Just Elections, Creating a Fair Electoral Process in the United States, a major contribution to our thinking, mentions the principle of equal weight only once. Dennis's larger position, with which I agree broadly speaking, is that the principle of equality takes the form of a principle of equal respect. The electoral process should provide citizens with equal opportunities to have their votes counted equally unless respectful reasons can be given to justify unequal treatment. Indeed, he writes, complete equality is undesirable. 11 pages later, he says, and this is his one mention, that, quotes, the principle of equal respect does not require that all votes have equal weight, provided that unequal treatment can be justified. And he gives a footnote at that point to Chuck Beitz's 1989 book, Political Equality, and continues to say correctly that, quotes, reasonable disagreement about electoral justice is not only inevitable but also desirable. Now, unfortunately, in my short comments, I cannot summarize Chuck's excellent political equality here. But his central and important point is that there is, quotes, an irreducible plurality of substantive interests associated with the idea of political fairness. Indeed, some ways in which we conceive of fairness conflict with other ways. I agree with this point completely. But the complexity and plurality within the idea of political fairness, which I accept and embrace, does not, in my view, destroy the independent standing of the principle of equal weight. It just says that this principle is far from being the whole of the complex set of principles that make up the larger idea of political fairness and political equality. Like other principles, it has problems of operationalization. It's a regulative principle, so it can't be fully achieved in practice. It has to be balanced against other principles, such as the need to give groups as well as individuals fair weight. And as with other principles, exceptions to it can sometimes be justified. I completely agree with Chuck that it must be distinguished from related principles such as equal outcomes, group equality, equal satisfaction, and equal influence. But I think we can do that distinguishing. We can point out, for example, that the principle of equal weight is most appropriate in moments of conflicting interests. In moments closer to the common interest, like in deliberation, the equal weight of individuals becomes irrelevant or even detrimental, and the force of the better argument should prevail. So these distinctions allow us to rescue the principle of equal weight analytically from the conceptual mush in which, as Chuck has shown us, it is usually embedded. In short, I fear that an emphasis on effectiveness will lead us to neglect principle. Even when we go beyond effectiveness to process, which Dennis stresses constantly, if we think of process primarily within the broad concept of fairness and equal respect, and within those concepts focus on the general idea of dependence, we will lose sight of the simple force of the principle of equal weight. The principle of equal weight explains simply and understandably why we would consider unions using their large membership to demand consideration of their interests legitimate, but not the business people using their large coffers to demand consideration of theirs. With this principle as an example, let me conclude by proposing more generally that instead of Larry's formulation of institutional corruption as describing an influence that weakens the effectiveness of an institution, he consider instead a formulation such as an influence that undermines the fundamental principles of an institution. Such a formulation allows us to ask what such fundamental principles are and take a stand upon them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Ken, Shepsle.
It's a pleasure to be here today. I was not on Nancy's list of colleagues. I'm a professor in the government department at Harvard. I was not on Nancy's list of colleagues in political theory because I'm not a political theorist. I guess I would be called a formal theorist. That's why I dressed up so nicely. But that's actually going to have some relevance for my remarks because my remarks are going to take slightly different tact than would be taken by a legal scholar or a political theorist. They will emphasize what I call general equilibrium effects and interrogating counterfactuals. In reading Larry's paper, I thought I might say our disagreements are only a matter of degree, 180 of them. But I'm not going to say that because I actually agreed with much of the thrust of Larry's wonderful paper. His ability to write in sentence fragments, which my English teacher would always circle and put -5 in the margin, they leapt off the page. They were as dramatic as his slides. I thought they were fantastic. Now, my remarks will also be a bit scattered, reflecting the richness of Larry's paper and my inclination to go off in 17 different directions at once. But before getting to them, let me say something about Dennis. Dennis and Carol and my wife Risa and I were together at Stanford's Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences in 1984-85. We were both at that time being recruited by Harvard, but at least until the very end of that year, neither of us knew the other was being recruited. We were united not only by intellectual interests, but by our interest in food and wine. It was a wonderful year, and we have been colleagues for 26 years. And I'm especially grateful in my darkest hours, when I was chair of the government department, that my strongest supporters were Dennis in the department and Carol as the associate dean. They supported me, they took my confession, they were marvelous friends, and I will always appreciate that. However, I did notice that Dennis had never served as chair of the department. He had, quote, immunized himself by other service in the university. And I always wondered whether immunization is a form of institutional corruption. Enough of that chit-chat. So Larry Lessig, following Dennis, thinks of institutional corruption as wrong if it adversely, quote, affects a practice in general. That is, it must be judged instrumentally. What is its tendency, he asks. What is its ordinary effect? Lessig believes money corrupts. But why money? Do votes corrupt? That is, and he's answered this to some extent, but let me lay it out again anyhow. That is, my people will vote for you if you do things for us in your political capacity. Perhaps it might be argued that votes are distributed equally, Jenny's equal weight principle, whereas money is not, to which I would offer a couple of responses. Why does equal distribution render a contribution ethically benign, while unequal contributions are ethically dubious? I'm not prejudging the answer, but I think an answer is required. Secondly, are other unequally distributed assets corrupt as contributions? Take intelligence. Is it a corrupting tendency for those with high intelligence to contribute this to a candidate's campaign, as, for example, this university's faculty is doing on behalf of, say, candidate Elizabeth Warren? Or what about media endorsements, or endorsements from union leaders or academics, or George Clooney or Barbara Streisand? And I'll return to this in a moment. But again, there are a lot of things that are unequally distributed that violate Jenny's equal weight principle. And we need to ask whether these are corrupting influences as well. There is a third response, and that is that money goes both ways. I consulted OpenSecrets.com, who had some data as of, I believe, the beginning of October. Obama's biggest supporter is the University of California system, faculty and staff. Harvard was fourth, by the way. Romney's biggest supporter, Goldman Sachs. The biggest industries contributing to Obama were lawyers and educators, Romney's, securities, and real estate firms. Now, it's unlikely that Democrats will outspend Republicans once we take 527 committees into account, but that's 2012. In 2008, Obama outspent McCain. The point I want to make is that funders, the Lesters of Larry Lessig's example, are a heterogeneous lot. Is this a mitigating factor? Still, Lessig may be right that money corrupts to whomever it is contributed, because it distorts what would have been without the money. This is a counterfactual, and a counterfactual is difficult to sustain outside the laboratory. And would it not give advantage to some other unregulated asset? This has been a problem throughout the history of regulation. The regulated are always one step ahead of the regulators. In effect, I am troubled by Thompson's notion of institutional corruption that relies on the idea of, quote, bypassing or short-circuiting or undermining or disregarding the democratic process. To identify an activity in this way requires a very tricky counterfactual analysis, namely what would the democratic process have yielded in the absence of an allegedly corrupt practice. There is a deeper problem, one that requires an appreciation of general equilibrium effects. We just don't know a great deal about how our entire system adjusts to a particular change. Would removing outside money, for example, level the playing field among candidates, or tilt it in the direction of those who can self-fund? When is the cure ameliorating, and when is it worse than the disease? A normative baseline, whether Thompson's or some other, against which to judge the merits of a practice or reform is inadequate. A positive theory of effects, one in which we have empirical confidence, is required. But only armed with such a worthy theory can we run the counterfactual analysis as a Gedanken experiment. Otherwise, we are left to speculate, where articulateness and casual persuasiveness are the trump cards. Let me raise a few other thoughts, and then I'll turn the rostrum back to the chair. Money in politics. How much is too much? That is this a mountain or a molehill? How rapidly does the marginal productivity of money decline? Was Obama's money advantage over McCain what made the difference in 2008? Will Romney's determine the 2012 result? These are questions to be answered. Incumbency. Does it substitute for money? Does it attract money? Both? Neither? Again, another thing that needs to be brought into the equation. As I mentioned a moment ago, Leicester heterogeneity. How much, and does it mitigate some of Larry Lessig's concerns? Do the Soroses, trial lawyers, and educators bring enough cash to the table to neutralize or at least diminish the influence of the Kochs, the Roves, et al.? Larry reminds me of C. Wright Mills and Floyd Hunter presuming a homogeneous power elite. Does the Dahl critique apply? Putting money and incumbency together, are legislative incumbents dependent on the funders, as Lessig claims, or are the funders dependent on the incumbents? And how would we go about answering that question? Remember the first law of wing walking in contemplating any change. The first law of wing walking says, don't let go of something till you have something else to hold on to. A conservative maxim, to be sure, but nonetheless good advice. Put differently, while conflicting dependence, to use Larry's term, would weaken the effect of the intended dependence on the people alone, do we know how to overcome the former in a manner that enhances the latter? In sum, my remarks should not be taken as anti-reformist, but rather as an admonition to be careful what you wish for. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Larry has some quick replies. We'll mix it up a little bit among the panel, and then we'll see if we can persuade Dennis to say a word, and then we'll have a general discussion. A quick reply, Larry?
Sure. I'm grateful for the comments. I didn't know political theorists or non-theorists were as generous and kind. Lawyers would have been much meaner, so I appreciate that. So with respect to Jenny's point, I guess I first think it's a foul to invoke an earlier article and pretend and suggest that I should be consistent across articles like this. And so I don't even remember the article, and I don't want to talk about it. But I do think we have a disagreement and an agreement. The disagreement is about whether we can characterize a fundamental principle in the United States tradition as simply as you've characterized it. Because you actually went between talking about the equal weight of a vote and equal weight generally. And we might agree about an equal weight of a vote, But the conflict that gets created and presented in a case like this is that there's another principle out there called the principle of free speech, and whether or not the framers would have invoked or relied upon equal opportunity to speak or equal weight of my speech, it is not the case today, the way it was with the apportionment cases, that America would rally around the idea that we all ought to be equalized in our capacity to speak about political campaigns. Whatever your view and my view are, it's just not taken for granted in this political society. So there's a conflict of principle here. The free speech principle versus the equal way to vote principle. Now, if I were to defend the earlier paper that tried to say that, you know, I care about the effect of this influence, I would point to the effect on the principles. But let me give that up and just talk about what is the principle here, because I do agree with you that we should identify the principles that we want to hold firm to. And I think I have identified a principle. What I've said is, consistent with Dennis's view that independence is one of the principles of legislative ethics, I've identified a different way of describing what independence is. I think in the way, you know, our framers would have suggested it as a research assistant sort of framed it for me, the way Jane Austen might have thought of it. Independence is the proper dependence, right? That's what independence is. And so when I say that that our democracy has evolved in conflicting dependence, what I'm saying is we've lost the principle of independence. What it means to be an independent legislature has been compromised. And that's the fundamental principle we ought to be defending. And so I can I think more quickly, more directly get to the conclusion that this system is corrupted from that principle, because I think we don't have an independent legislature. Ken, conspiring with my English teacher, I don't appreciate that, but okay. I agree, of course, you know, for the reason I've just suggested, that equality is not going to be a general principle that cuts across all of this. But I do want to be a little precise about what the problem with funding is, or what the problem with the Lesters is. Because I haven't said the problem with the Lesters is there's too much spending on campaigns. And I haven't said the problem with with the Lesters is that there's too much, you know, that the money is effective in controlling the results. What I've focused on is the way in which the need to raise money, either directly or indirectly, directly by, you know, getting people to contribute to your campaign, indirectly by doing the right dance so that people send the money to the right independent political action committee. That activity is the corrupting activity. Even if the money has no effect, and even if we're spending far too little money in politics, this corruption still stands. That's the essence of what I'm calling corruption. And finally, just to close it, I'm not making a claim about the harmfulness or good of that corruption. So I don't think I have to bear the burden, although I would be happy to, but I don't think in this context I'd have to bear the burden of demonstrating why this is bad or good. The only thing I'm trying to do is to advance a conception of corruption that allows us in good faith to say the system is corrupt, so that we can open up a field for legislative responses, which is at this point closed by the very closed-minded sense of corruption that the Supreme Court deploys. So I have, you know, a tiny little lawyer's work here against the, you know, scale of large political philosophy projects, but that's the only task I set myself for.
All right. Could I put a question to Larry and either colleague on the panel who would like to respond? It dependence corruption. The principle is independence. Independence for the sake of what? Republican government, you said, is the source of that, Larry. Is it independence of private interest and money for the sake of fairness in the electoral process? Or is it independent for the sake of a political system that will aim at the common good? Any of you who would like, and then we'll call on.
So I don't know the answer why they would have this conception of independence. I mean, I have my own view, And I want to be very specific I'm talking about independence of one department, the legislative department, right? When we say we have an independent judiciary, what we mean by that is a judiciary that doesn't get to do whatever the hell it wants. It means a judiciary that's dependent upon the law. That's what independent judiciary means, dependent upon the law. And what I'm suggesting is they have a conception of the democratic branch of our government, which of course didn't at this time include the Senate, it's just the House. But the House, which would be dependent upon the people alone, right? Not just one of their influences would be the people among others. This is it, dependent upon the people alone. Now, of course, Jenny could give us lots of reasons to have questions about what the architecture of that dependence should look like. You know, what kind of theory of representation is built into that conception of dependence. All I've said is, whatever it is, it's not consistent with the idea of being dependent upon lesters as a precondition to being allowed to exercise your play with the people. So that's just a narrow way of saying this is dependence. This is what independence for this department is. And you know, if we had a full theory of the Constitution, we want judiciary dependent in a particular way, the House dependent in a particular way, the Senate is dependent upon the states, the President is dependent, I think, upon the people and upon the law. I mean, these are different schemes of kind of mechanisms, which is the nature of their understanding of constitutional government.
All right. Dennis, can we persuade you to say a word about the discussion so far, maybe to throw a little bit of gasoline on the fire, or maybe to put it out?
What
do you
certainly
think?
Not try to put it out. I'm not on the program. That's one reason I should be brief. And so I'm until tomorrow. And another reason, perhaps, is that I want to thank and praise everybody, but I don't want to do that until I see if it can be continued through tomorrow, too. And yet another reason, Larry, in the written version of the paper, begins by saying there's something simple, almost pleasurable, in the idea of corruption. And then he says, Dennis Thompson denies us that simple pleasure. So I don't want to deny you or compound the offense, I guess, by denying you the simple pleasure of dinner, another debate later, and the question period. So first, just let me say I really do appreciate Larry's careful and mostly sympathetic critique of my ideas about institutional corruption. Though perhaps the sympathy shouldn't be surprising, but if he can find something good in Jack Abramoff, then he ought to be able to find something good in me. Still, I have to say he did present my argument fairly, more fully, I'd say, than most critics. And in the written paper, he actually goes back and looks at other things I've written, which I had some of the same reaction he did to Jenny's looking at things he had written in the past. Did I say that? Larry's main criticism in the paper, and you got some of it here, is that we don't need to know anything about the procedures or the process of an institution to determine that there's institutional corruption. And I think there's less disagreement here than might seem, or if we disagree, Larry's wrong and I'm right. The procedures, as he actually indicated, and Jenny then brought out even more, the procedures I have in mind are not just the rules and norms of an institution, but the larger process, in this case, the democratic process in which the institution resides. So, in my view, the institutional corruption, or a general sign of the institutional corruption, is the short-circuiting of the democratic process, the shorthand term I use, and that Ken objected to, captures the emphasis on process that I think is important. Jenny agrees with that, and she, as she said, takes it further, and she takes it further into territory about political equality. I don't want to go quite that far, but I do want to say that the gross inequality in the campaign finance system that Larry's highlighting with the story about Lesterland and the Union Corporation scenario is a distortion of the process. And it is a form of institutional corruption. It isn't exactly what I focused on, but I don't want to have a definitional argument. Yes, it's institutional corruption. I don't want to reject dependence corruption, either practically or theoretically. So I don't think there's a lot of disagreement there. Process more, I'm with Jenny, but the fact that this is institutional corruption and that we should be concerned about it is consistent with what I want to say. I think there may be a difference that wasn't brought out so much between Larry and me, or maybe it's a difference of emphasis. It turns on the fact that I want to emphasize more than he does a distinctive feature of institutional corruption. Not always a necessary condition, but it turns on the fact that some dependence, even money dependence, is actually necessary and even desirable. And this might be a way of trying to find something in what Ken said that I agree with. A core feature of institutional corruption is that the gain that a politician gets, or any professional gets, is a useful, necessary part of doing the job. So campaigns can't be run without funding. Research can't be done, medical research can't be done without support. Universities can't be run without donors. And public or grassroots support is not likely to come about and completely replace all of these, the current usual suspects. So unlike ordinary corruption, bribery, we just can't, the solution, the reforms can't be just to stop the flow of cash. We have to find a different way of providing the support. Maybe some of the reforms that Larry has talked about will help. But we also have to find ways to control the way that the support that we don't really like that much comes into the institution and is used in better ways than it is now. So the need for money won't go away, but there are better and worse ways of dealing with it. Okay, I'm going to stop, but before I stop, I do want to first thank the commentators and Michael for this very stimulating panel. But I want to pay tribute to Larry's achievement in corruption. That's what I wrote here, achievement in corruption. But that's, when I read that, it isn't quite right. Though if you saw that, you've got to see the Abramoff Lessig little thing. But it's available on YouTube. Of all the people who picked up on the idea of institutional corruption since I wrote about it and before, Larry's contribution is clearly, I think, the most important. And not the least, it's important intellectually because it's challenged me and several of the rest of you, and you can see others here too. But also because nobody in the academy has done more to put the problem on the public agenda than Larry. And someday, I think we might even be able to say that his work and the work of the lab in the center, in the Safra Center, put an end to institutional corruption as we know it. That would indeed be a simple pleasure. So thank you, Larry, and thank you, panel.
Thank you, Dennis. But we're not done yet. We're not done yet because we want to take advantage of this remarkably distinguished audience for some further discussion of the issues that have just been launched. And I've seen a couple of hands. Jeremy Waldron.
Larry, this was a...
Can everybody hear you? Maybe you should use that handheld microphone there.
Okay. Hello. This was a fabulous presentation. I want to urge you to take it one step further And this is going to involve questioning the contrast between dependence upon the people and dependence upon the funders. We have to be aware of what the money is spent on, why the candidates need money. They don't need it for yachts or sex or vacations or patios. That's the individual corruption, but in the case that you're talking about, the money is used to reach out to the people. If one didn't have to reach out to the people and convince them that the programs that one had been pursuing or the programs that one will be pursuing were in the people's interests, one wouldn't need all that money. You wouldn't need to buy all that TV time. You wouldn't need the plane to fly you to Arizona and then up to Maine and then down to Florida and then to Ohio and so on. It's because everybody all over this vast continent has an equally weighted vote that the candidates need to find ways of reaching out to them. So that the funder dependence is dependent on the people dependence. You can't just simply organize a contrast between the two. I'm not saying that the account of institutional corruption here is wrong, but it can't be presented as a simple contrast. The situation is different from the Leicesters because the Leicester dependence in the story that you told is not oriented towards the general election in the way that the funder dependence is oriented towards the general election. If we didn't have a democracy with the equal votes that Jenny talked about, and I bless her for emphasizing that, if we didn't have a democracy, if it was just a dictatorship, then maybe you'd need some money for weapons, and maybe you'd need some money to bribe highly influential people. But we need our money, or candidates in this republic need their money to reach out to every last person. And so we have to give an account of the corrupting influence, the way it gets screwed up, which works from that premise rather than the simplistic contrast. I guess the idea is if I can't reach out to the people, or can't reach out in a way that would really convince them or manipulate them or persuade them, unless I get money from the donor, the funder, then the program that I have to try to convince the people of is got to be a program oriented to the interests of the funder. But it's got to be done that long way around, it seems.
All right, so Larry, remember that. And let's take a couple more. Tim Scanlon.
Thank you, Jeremy. My question's a little bit orthogonal to that, but if you want, I'll go ahead and ask it. One of the interesting things about the idea of institutional corruption that Larry and Dennis have developed is that it applies to a wide range of institutions, not just to governments, but to universities, hospitals, other kinds of institutions. And in universities, let's say, it occurs when, for example, faculty members may be subject to financial interests, which would cause them to act in ways that undermine the truth-seeking and truth-teaching function of the university. I could say something about other similar institutions, but one of the things there is that the thing that's subverted, the objection we feel when we feel this is a kind of corruption, doesn't have anything to do with equality. But when Leicesterland was put on the screen, we did have a feeling about equality. There was something objectionable about the Leicesters, in effect, being able to veto who could compete in the general election. Now, that idea of equality might be cashed out in two ways, which have been mentioned in passing in the discussion. It might be cashed out as Jenny was saying, in terms of equal vote. There we'd have this inside baseball argument between Chuck and others about whether we can make sense of this, but there seems to be something wrong. There are people, the Leicesters have a kind of influence on what's happening, which seems unfair. However, we're going to cash that out. We can leave that. Or we might put it in terms of free speech, that they're drowning out, the Leicesters are drowning out other kind of people, because it's not just they're enabling the candidates to campaign, they're doing the campaigning themselves, and they're preventing other people from putting in their 2 cents about who's going to now that unfairness doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't seem to matter much whether the Leicesters agree among themselves, and this is Ken's point. I think it's the fact that just these people, this small group, has got the veto power. That seems objectionable. Whether it turns out that we're lucky and there's just as many on one party as there are on the other party, that doesn't seem to matter. So it seems to me that your argument involves a kind of Trojan horse idea. The Supreme Court rejected in Buckley the free speech version of bringing equality in. It doesn't seem very friendly to the equal vote idea. They don't want to decide what's equal, but they brought in Buckley brought in corruption as an alternative to that. And you're saying, well, but there's a broader sense of corruption. But if that broader sense of corruption counts as corruption only because it's a kind of inequality, then what we're doing is we're bringing in equality without having to actually use the word through the idea of corruption. Now, I've just revealed myself to be one of those political philosophers who doesn't have to worry about convincing anybody, in particular those people in that building you put up there. So I should defer to you and say maybe I should just shut up and not reveal that this is what's going on. But I wonder whether there isn't a little bit of a sleight of hand or something in trying to package under a redefined idea of corruption what's a fundamental idea of equality that seems important to our own sense that there's something wrong here.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And Francis Cam. And then we'll let some people, Larry and others, respond.
Maybe this follows up. I think the argument could be strengthened because there seem to be two different stages here. We objected to the Leicester lands, right? And there the idea was that money at that stage, all right, or the Leicesters, and you compared them to money, would select out the people that the rest of us could vote on. I would be just as upset if all the members of the labor union, and only the members of the labor union, decided who the rest of us could vote on. So the issue of labor versus money doesn't, the part of the argument I want to see clarified is when it's at the stage of who selects the people the rest of us vote on, it's just as bad, I think, whether it's labor or money. Okay, so that might be some response to Jenny's question. But you were trying to make a conclusion about the general election, you see. And you can't use evidence of the Leicesters, right, what happens in Leicesterland, right, where it's wrong that the money controls, to make an argument about it's being okay for labor to control the general election but not money, because the argument against the Leicesters was at the point of their selecting who the rest of us can vote on. But that argument weighs just as much against labor.
So, do you want me to respond? Yeah. Okay. So first, with respect to response to Jeremy, thank you for that comment. Because it helps me see a part that I said, but I didn't say clearly enough. So in my utopia, I'm an Ackermanian, Ian Ayres utopian, so I believe that elections ought to be funded with vouchers. Everybody should have a voucher, and I should be able to give my voucher to candidates, and we could say candidates that agree to fund their campaigns only with vouchers. So let's imagine a world where all of us had a $50 voucher. That's how we funded campaigns. That would be a world where the candidates are dependent upon the funders. We have the people and the funders. I mean, the candidates and the funders, and the candidates are dependent upon the funders. But that world's different from this world because now the funders are everybody. They cut across the political spectrum, the income perspective, everything. They're all of us. So what's distinctive and troubling about the version of Leicesterland that we've produced is it's a tiny fraction of us that is in no way, no conceivable way representative of the rest of us. Now people say, well, what do you mean? There are people on the left and there are people on the right who are comprising the 0.05%. But to be a billionaire on the left and a billionaire on the right does not yet introduce all the perspectives of humanity that we need to understand if we're going to be legislating for a nation of 311 million people. I mean, they don't understand a significant portion of the issues that are relevant to the rest of us. So I agree with you, we're going to have dependence upon the funders. The distinctive corrupting feature is that the funders are in no way representative of the people. Okay, now, this really forces me against the hard position, which Tim is putting before me. And I want to admit that there might be a version of institutional corruption in my own thinking here. And here's why there might be that version. No answer that invokes equality will survive on this Supreme Court, right? I mean, so extreme are they that in the latest case, which was the Arizona case challenging the public funding system in Arizona, the Chief Justice, in argument, said, I went to the website of this program. And I found on that website reference to the desire to equalize the playing field. So this is just about equality, so therefore it's unconstitutional. So the fact that the website uses the word equality is for this court enough to throw it out. Okay, so I admit that when I assert that I believe that my description is not in the end about equality, I admit I just might be deluding myself because I recognize overwhelmingly this influence is driving me to that. But I do believe this isn't in the end about equality. I believe it's about the description of a proper dependence, which in some cases overlaps with equality but doesn't necessarily overlap with equality. So again, I don't believe that if the state of Michigan had passed a law that said unions are not allowed to turn out people to vote, because we can see in the state of Michigan, unions have unequal power when they turn people out to vote. They have more power than ordinary people do because they have so many union people. So we're going to equalize the power of unions by saying unions can't turn people out to vote. That law would not be justified by my theory of dependence corruption, but it would be justified by an equality theory. So, I mean, you know, maybe not your equality theory, but my point is equality would be the sort of reason you would be advancing in defense of that, but my theory wouldn't defend that law at all. So I think there's a space, and obviously there's a lot of work to do here, but there's a space to say there is a difference between saying there's a problem because the wrong dependency has developed, and there's a problem because there's unequal resources in the end. And then finally, just to clarify again, it's helpful to see it wasn't clear enough to Francis. When I said that there's an easy way to say that the money is corruption, but the labor is not, I meant to say more clearly, that's not to say that in any political system, it's obvious that the money is corruption and the labor is not. It's possible to imagine America. Some people dream of an America like this, but it's possible to imagine America where labor unions represent a tiny fraction of us, and they are overwhelmingly dominant in controlling political outcomes. In that world, to be dependent upon labor is, is the Leicester in that world. All that I was asserting is that's not our world. We're nowhere close to that. So I asserted, and I had this in red, I believe, I'm pretty confident of this, contingently, it was the case that it's easy for me to get to the conclusion that the money is corrupting in this world, but the labor is not corrupting in this world, even though conceptually we could have a different mix of influences that yielded the conclusion that labor was corrupting and money was not. You know, I'm just describing the path that's necessary for me to assert something in what I understand to be the political circumstance of this world.
We have time for some more. Oh, Jenny, you want to answer?
Yeah, could I just... I'm really glad that you said that in the end it is about equality, because that explains why I was puzzled. And I apologize for the inside the Beltway stuff about chuck bites and so forth. I was just trying to figure out why weren't you talking about what it seemed sort of obvious you should be talking about. And I thought it must be because Dennis said in his book that political equality, that votes of equal weight weren't that important, and then he footnoted bites and so forth, because otherwise I couldn't figure out why it would be. But if what it is you can't make that argument to the Supreme Court, well, then I understand it. But from the, from the perspective of political philosophy, though, from the perspective of doing a kind of analytic job, you can see why I thought it might be a good idea to look at the issue of votes of equal weight. And I think that it isn't the issue that you pointed out about the unions. What if the unions organized and got out? Well, then wouldn't we have wasn't that unequal? There's a really great difference between inequality in individuals having unequal votes, and groups. In other words, I could have an equal vote, but none of you could agree with me. In that case, I lose, and I lose always, over and over and over and over again. And you could say that as a member of a group, namely a group of me, I have no power in this larger enterprise, but I do have my equally weighted vote. And so I think analytically we really need to distinguish between those two, and I was only talking about the equally weighted vote, and these funders have unequally weighted votes, just on that very simple individual level.
This is on a slightly different topic, but it goes back to Michael's original question to Larry and Dennis's concern that in describing institutional corruption, Larry did not incorporate the notion of procedural factors. My reading of the debates of the Constitutional Convention was that independence for the legislature meant independence from the executive. And the constitutional founders were concerned not only about faction, but also about cabal. And it would seem to me that one form of corruption and one dimension of the role of money as a corrupting influence would be the extent to which it destroys that parchment wall between the legislature and the executive. There are many, many features of our arrangements, from different term lengths, different timing of elections, and so on, that attempted to liberate the legislature from the executive. But it would seem to me that one place that I would look for a corrupting influence of assets would be the degree to which the legislature and the executive's independence from one another was harmed.
Yeah, but to respond to that particular, I agree when I say their conception was dependent upon the people alone. There's a whole bunch of other things that might be producing improper dependencies. We've now noticed the improper dependency produced by private wealth. They were obsessed with the improper dependency produced by favors with the executive. That was the British Crown experience. But it's not the only thing that they worried about. I mean, one of my favorite clauses in the Constitution is Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, which says that, and no person holding any office or profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state, right? So they have this idea of foreign princes having and creating this improper dependency. We constitutionalize a principle against that. They didn't think about domestic princes having the same effect, so they didn't constitutionalize the principle against that, but all I'm saying is we had to evolve the understanding to get there. And just to insist, again, acknowledging that I could be living in a state of false consciousness, I really don't believe, Jenny, I really don't believe the theory is about equality. I believe there's a theory of equality out there, and I love it. I love it. It's great. But I don't think it's about a theory of equality, because I do believe there's a competing principle in here, and that principle, however you define equality of vote, the Lesters in our system are exercising the inequality of speech. And that's the dynamic that I think is, and unless you expand vote.
I totally think that one principle can contradict another. So I'm not saying that votes of equal weight is the only dominant principle. I'm just saying it's a principle. To analyze it out, you have to think about that principle, and then there's another principle, freedom of speech. They conflict sometimes. That's just analytically, that's the clear way to go about it, I think.
Yuli Tamir.
I just have a short comment and a question. The comment is that I'm a foreigner, so I come from Israel, and we have public funding for elections. So I can tell you it will be surprising to know how many other ways there are to create institutional corruptions when you don't have it. However, I think what you're missing is really a class issue that is not only about the 3 or 4 substantial donors, who, by the way, are very known to everybody, and therefore the politicians are very careful about, giving them all sorts of little favors, because everybody knows who sponsors whom. But it's the big difference between those who can organize not only unions, and you are, as a politician, and I have been a politician for many years, dependent on them, against those who can't organize, usually the less vocal, less able members of the society. So the people politicians are really dependent on are not the 5 or 6 people that give the money, that are those who can organize in the society, and are therefore, it's easier for them to neglect those who are never organized. Here, do not register, we don't have registration, who would never have the money to just buy the bus ticket to go to a public meeting. and would never be heard and would never be even given the chance to put pressure. So putting pressure is actually a middle class thing, and the lower classes are totally excluded. And for me, I don't know, do you think it's a corruption? Is that a problem? How is it related to equality? Because for me, it's a much greater problem than the 3 big donors. Everybody knows who they are.
Yes, there's a hand up there. I can't see who you are. Could you identify yourself?
Jim Snyder, a lab fellow. My question is, how should we define money? We accept that as a term that it's clear. In particular, what I have in mind is the difference between money and in-kind contributions. So I think the type of examples you focused on at the presidential level maybe is not such an important distinction, but in many other areas of politics, this is very important. I don't know of any government ethics forum that doesn't ask for both money and in-kind contributions, for example, for any office, certainly at the federal level, and I think also at the state and local level. So just to give you an example, for say a legislative seat, when you're running for office, typical gerrymandered, polarized districts, you want to get yard signs up. In my district, you want to get about 5,000 up if you're a Republican or a Democrat. So where do you go to get motivated people that have the prime yard sites and get all those signs? Well, if you're a Republican, you go to the churches and the pro-life forces, and you get thousands of people, and they know all the good spots, and that's how you do it. If you're a Democrat, you go to the unions, and they, get those signs up there. Now, those are incredibly valuable assets, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there are many other groups like diffuse parental interest, and they can't get those signs up there. They can't have the influence. So it's another way of asking this question about organization, but it translates into very substantial in-kind assets. There are all of these in-kind assets that are vital, and they're an important form of money, really. We shouldn't make such a sharp distinction between paper money and these other types of contributions.
Let me take one more.
This is a minor point, but Larry, it seems to me your treatment of Federalist 10 suggests an important contribution to the discussion with Professor Mansbridge about process versus outcome. And just to put it in an example, I mean, it's when if Goldman Sachs were to spend a lot of money to protect the spotted owl, it wouldn't raise our spider sense. And even if they were to spend a lot of money to create free and fair open markets for a prosperous America, we wouldn't care. But it's the fact that they might use their money to, say, get corporate loopholes and tax policy and SEC regulations passed that would benefit them to the detriment of the public interest that we say this is a corrupt process. And it seems to me, process is very important, but at the end of the day, we're evaluating those because of these sort of moral judgments. And Madison's account of kind of early account of rent seeking is a moral judgment about the kind of outcomes through which we evaluate this whole process. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that kind of moral judgment at the end of the day. That quality can be an important process principle, but we're going to really judge this by not only whose interests are being represented, but how they might be to the detriment of the larger public interest. And that judgment is really important to keep in view.
So again, the first two questions are extremely helpful to clarify, to put me into an awkward position, because there's going to be an analytically clear point which will feel uncomfortable. So I think we have a corrupt system because we have a system dependent upon the Lesters, and the Lesters are not the people. Okay, that's the point I was making to Jeremy's comment. But could we imagine a world where the Lesters were the people? So imagine, Jim Fishkin's deliberative poll. Right? We select 500 people randomly, representative. We put them into a room and we say to them, pick the candidates. From my perspective, I have a difficulty calling that dependence corruption. Right? I mean, you're dependent upon a small group of the people, and Francis doesn't like any small group of Lesters. But actually, I've now defined it such that the Lesters here plausibly represent the people, plausibly. We could argue about whether they do, but plausibly. So that's a hardest case. I mean, that's the case where it kind of seems counterintuitive. That might not be a case of dependence corruption. In the middle are the cases that you're talking about and I think Jim is talking about. And I'm completely willing to admit there's going to be gray lines in this framework where it might not be as easy to get to an answer as I think it is easy to get to an answer in America today. And in those cases, we might need to invoke what I think of as the complementing set of insights, which Dennis's work is doing. The only thing I was saying is, it turns out we have a shortcut. We can short circuit the institutional corruption analysis in this political context because of the character of the nature of the funders relative to the people. And it won't be the case always and everywhere, and it might not be the case in Maryland for Jim, and it might not be the case with respect to the influence you're talking about in Israel, and then we have to rely on something else. And then with respect to Bill's point about Federalist 10, that's very, very helpful. That's right. But again, I think it brings out a contingent weakness, a weakness that we have contingently that at least Madison didn't believe they would have. And that is the capacity for us to articulate what the public good is. Right? So we don't think we have that capacity anymore. We don't think in a way that the Supreme Court believed it could utter one person, one vote is obvious. We don't believe we have the capacity to say, Goldman Sachs doing X is against the public interest. You and I have a strong view on it. Other people have a strong view on it, but we don't have this collective capacity. And Madison would have thought we did in a whole bunch of areas that we are now skeptical of, right? So having found ourselves in a world where the social meaning of politics is such that we don't have that capacity, I think we have to fall back on other things. And that's where I'm perfectly willing to embrace the other things as procedural, in the sense of, is this a system which is making the results dependent upon a group properly called the people, or are they the Lesters? And so that in this sense is just admitting the incapacity we have, the thinness of our capacity for describing the public good that distinguishes us from them.
Before we thank our panel, I just want to remind you that we're going to start meeting tomorrow morning, breakfast at 9 o'clock. The panels start at 9:30 in a different location. We're going to be in Cy Auditorium at CGIS South on Cambridge Street. And the first panel will be a paper by Jeremy Waldron. So we'll see you tomorrow morning, and let's thank Larry and Ken and Jenny.